إن الحمد لله نحمده تعالى ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. All praise in its entirety is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Him we seek refuge, through Him we seek guidance, and only to Him do we turn in repentance. He whomever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides and brings to the path of light, no one is capable of the misguidance of. And he whomever chooses to oppress themselves and lead themselves astray, no one is capable of bringing back to guidance. And I bear witness that there is no deity worthy of worship or love or adulation except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah alone, and that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is his servant, his final messenger, who wholeheartedly and faithfully conveyed the message until the end of time. My dear brothers and sisters, I want to take you through a very brief history of the origins of Islam, and in particular, the message of Islam to the Arabian Peninsula that came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and rocked the entire community that he was in. But before even the message, we need to understand what was the context and the conditions that required that this message be revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ at this specific location, in this particular part of the world. Because at the time, there was a message of Tawheed that was circulating, and it was a message that Isa alayhi salam had espoused. But of course, as we know, that message over time had been adulterated and modified in ways that were no longer consistent with the divine intentions, and which was no longer relevant to the people of the time. And so, the message of Islam came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the people in that area of the world at a time where corruption was unprecedented, at a time where tribal killings were at extraordinary levels, where a tribe would try to expropriate and extract revenge from another tribe over a very trivial dispute that is so distant behind both that neither of them actually even knows why they're still in conflict. And this tribal mentality led to so much bloodshed between so many different groups, and there was so much ignorance in general that this period of time was literally called and is referred to as the time of Jahiliyyah, a time of true ignorance. And Jahiliyyah meaning perpetual ignorance that has almost no boundaries, because there was ignorance in so many respects. There was ignorance in terms of lack of education, so there was educational ignorance. There was ignorance in terms of akhlaq and adab. There was a lack of etiquette, a lot of mannerisms in terms of dealing with people. There was an ignorance even in terms of understanding the very value and essence and sanctity of life. And when you are ignorant to the value of life, that is an ultimate form of ignorance. And this was unfortunately manifested in all of the bloodshed that was happening. People getting killed over the most ridiculous and trivial of things, and most trivial of disputes. Girls who were particularly killed because at that time and in that cultural context, having girls was considered a source of shame, a source of sorrow. And as a consequence, a lot of men would actually kill their daughters and even bury them alive. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment will resurrect these girls who were killed innocently and frivolously and for no reason, and ask them the rhetorical question, and ask the community the question, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. And if the one who was buried alive is asked on that day, for what deed were you killed? What did you do, you 3-year-old, you 4-year-old, you innocent little child, that merited your parents to bury you alive? So this was a time of unprecedented levels of ignorance in society. And there was a true need for a message that not only will bring internal peace to the people who receive this message, but a message that will create social peace, that will create a social order, that will attempt to reconcile these massive differences between people, and bring them back to an understanding of what it means to be subservient to an ultimate authority, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was the context of the revelation of the Quran, and this was the time of Jahiliyyah. Unfortunately, although the specifics and details of the Jahiliyyah are different, we today live in a different form and a different manifestation of Jahiliyyah that exists in many parts of the world. And many of us recognize this. If we look at the Muslim community on a global scale in different Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries, we'll still see that blood is being shed in many reasons and in many cases over very frivolous things. The life of a human being, a Muslim, is apparently worth very little because it is killed over the most minute and trivial of pursuits. We still see abductions and killings. We still see honor killings. And we understand and we defend and we speak up and we refute and we condemn and we talk about how these are things that have no basis in Islam. They have no relation to Islam. And that's fine when we have that understanding. But we as a community are as strong as our weakest link. And any relay race is as fast as the slowest runner. And since none of us is in a moral position to tell someone whether they are or are not Muslims, after all, that's a judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If someone comes to you and says, I'm a Muslim, no matter how reprehensible their behaviors are, it's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to judge that statement. You as a Muslim, you have to take it at face value. What are you going to say? You're going to give takfir to the person without understanding their context, their maluk? That's not your job, it's not your authority, and you won't even be asked on the Day of Judgment. And this is sort of a side point, and I'll make it very quickly. A lot of brothers and sisters feel that in order for them to protect their own understanding of Islam, they have to alienate others by labeling them as non-Muslims. And as a consequence, you create this sort of exclusive environment where only people who share your understanding of Islam are Muslims, and everybody else isn't. And scholars have time and time again said, and sworn by Allah, that you will not be asked on the Day of Judgment, why did you not call so-and-so a kafir, or a non-Muslim, or an infidel? Allah's not going to ask you that. But He will ask you, why did you call so-and-so a disbeliever, or a non-Muslim? And you better have a very legitimate answer to that question. And the Prophet ﷺ said in an authentic hadith that is very explicit, that whoever calls someone a kafir, it's true for either of the two, one of them two. Either you are correct in your assessment, in which case you accurately identify that someone is an infidel or a disbeliever, in which case you gain nothing, or you're inaccurate, you're false, you calumniously call someone and label someone something that is untrue, and as a consequence, you become the disbeliever. So it's a lose-lose situation to engage in this practice. But nevertheless, we're in a situation right now as Muslims where we see many people around the world who call themselves Muslims, who declare to be Muslims, but who act in ways that are completely disaligned with any concept of Islam that you and I are familiar with, and many Muslims are familiar with, and scholars historically have been unfamiliar with. So how do we address these issues? Well, the most obvious thing we can do, and we do, is we condemn. And for example, many of you are aware of the recent tragedies happening in Nigeria with the group Boko Haram. And to those of you who aren't aware of what's happening in this issue, this is a militant group that has a particular interpretation of Islam that determines that Western education is sinful. And as a consequence, they have a mandate to make sure that Muslims are not corrupted by Western education. That is their belief. And for that reason, they retaliate against their government by attacking schools, which of course often include and have many children. And recently, the group had claimed responsibility for abducting over 270 girls from a school, and essentially the belief is that these girls are going to be sold as slaves to some of the soldiers who are part of this movement, and it's a devastating, tragic situation. And this group claims that they are not only Muslims, but they are true Muslims who are looking to implement Sharia, apparently, in Nigeria. Now, a lot of Muslims haven't necessarily spoken up in condemnation of these behaviors. And some have. And their condemnation of this issue has been that this is absolutely repugnant, this is absolutely unacceptable, and it's absolutely un-Islamic. And that is 100% agreeable. This is a worse form of jahiliyyah than the jahiliyyah even before Islam arrived. Girls were offered education. It was just the shame factor that was why some men opted to actually hurt or kill their daughters. Whereas now you're seeing that women are simply being told not to be educated. We have no precedent, no evidence whatsoever in the Islamic literature, in Islamic history, suggesting that we should not engage in other forms of education besides Islamic education. In fact, some of the most prolific scholars in history were people who produced so-called secular knowledge, from the mathematics to the optics to the chemistry to the biology, etc. And we as Muslims today would not be where we are if it weren't for incorporating elements of secular knowledge, if we really want to divide the lines of knowledge according to these strict definitions. But we have to take a step back and understand what are the conditions that bring about a group like this, or a group like Al-Qaeda, who has a different mandate but essentially a similar problem optics-wise for the Muslim community globally. Another group that does things that are disagreeable by the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of Muslims around the world. They're not validated or justified scholastically by the vast majority of scholars that are living and have passed away, and yet they claim to be very adherent followers of Islam. And this poses a huge problem for the vast majority of us who, in the society we live in, try to explain to people that this is not consistent with Islam. It's very hard because nobody has that moral superiority to say that my understanding of Islam is superior. All we can really say are statistical things like these very statements. The vast majority of Muslims don't do this. So if we take a step back and try to understand, why does a group like Boko Haram even exist? And there's a lot of analysis that was published about this that goes a layer a little bit deeper than just a strict condemnation, because there is no disagreement, there's no dispute. Of course it's reprehensible to do any of these things. Whether they were Muslim or not, it's reprehensible. The fact that they're Muslim is even more reprehensible because our scripture, our deen, our Prophet ﷺ have set an example that is the exact opposite of this. But how did a group like this come to be? When you look at Nigeria, which has the 7th largest population in the world, and in terms of GDP, one of the world's largest economies, and you look at the corruption index, and you find that it is one of the most corrupt countries in the world to do business in, the picture starts to shift a little bit. And you start to understand, not justify, but you start to understand that there are some conditions that, when put in place, create violence, create radicalism, create extremism in thinking. And when you look at the fact that the president of Nigeria not too long ago fired one of his top financial officials in the government because that official was trying to investigate $20 billion of unaccounted for oil revenues. The president fired him, showing that there is a pervasive amount of corruption on a governmental level. And so a group like Boko Haram says, we're not against education. We're against the type of education that produces these types of corrupt politicians, which ultimately propagate our problems as a community. So from a framework point of view, that's not an inaccurate analysis. That's not necessarily a bad intention, that you disagree with the corrupt regime, you disagree with the system that produces people who are corrupt, and you prefer to advocate for a system that will educate people in a way that will not produce corruption. This is a very normal thing that any rational person would desire. Now, the problem is when you take it to the extreme of saying that you're now going to wipe out that system, or you are going to attack innocent children in schools who happen to be in these systems. This is where the problem, unfortunately, arises from. But we have to understand that our dialogue cannot be simplistic. And when we look at something like this, yes, we alienate and we have to condemn a group like Boko Haram for what they have done. Again, this is not negotiable. But does it stop there? Or do we go at the root cause and say that we must condemn the systematic corruption that creates a group like Boko Haram? Because we can remove a group like Boko Haram tomorrow. It's possible. But if we don't remove the source that created a group like this, another group will emerge, and another group, and another group. And instead of treating and curing the problem from its roots, we're just constantly treating the symptoms. And we're putting all of our optics and focus on them. So when we pressure our governments to take action, we should pressure them to take action on both levels. Treat the immediate problem, but put as much, if not more, resources in uprooting the source of the problem to begin with. And this is why we need to advocate not only for our government to provide resources, intelligence, etc., to try to identify who these individuals are and bring them to justice, but to refuse to engage in business dealings with countries that have systematically corrupt practices that trickle down on society, create massive injustice amongst members of its society, and therefore perpetrate and create violence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran repeatedly, ظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ. The corruption has appeared in both land and sea by what the hand of man has obtained. And the hand of man has obtained, بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِي النَّاسِ, has been interpreted and analyzed by scholars in many, many different rich and deep contexts of understanding and context. And some of them talk about it meaning what they have actually earned. So the way and manner in which people make money, the greed, the intensity with which people try to secure their own financial positions, makes them so self-centered, so self-focused, that they will become corrupt even if they don't think they're being corrupt. And this is one of the problems of corruption in and of itself. That someone might think that they are achieving a good means, or they might try to rationalize their form of corruption in order to continue to be corrupt. And this could be one manifestation of it. So when we look at the government, and the government that's laundering and robbing the resources of its people, we can look at that as a form of corruption, as a form of what the hand has earned. But we can also look at it as destruction that the hand creates in the land. And we see this also in other parts of the Quran. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يُعْجِبُكَ قَوْلُهُ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَيُشْهِدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا فِي قَلْبِهِ وَهُوَ أَلَدُّ الْخِصَامِ وَإِذَا تَوَلَّى سَعَى فِي الْأَرْضِ لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا وَيُهْلِكَ الْحَرْثَ وَالنَّسْلَ وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْفَسَادَ. And from people are those whose speech, whose eloquence, whose form of presentation is very attractive to the people. And they're able to win people's hearts and voices. And I don't need to give examples. You can understand where this is going. People who are very, very appealing speakers and can get to your emotion, and they can promise that they will do this and that if they get elected. And they will get rid of this and that if they get elected. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what is actually in their hearts, and they are up to no good. And when that person has power, and when that person strikes the ground and starts to exercise that power, they go into the land to engage in and foster corruption, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like corruption. And when we understand that Islam, coming at a time of Jahiliyyah, to a people who were engaged in systematic corruption, we understand that one of the primary essences and pillars of Islam is to eradicate and eliminate corruption. It's to normalize society and create within society an infrastructure that prevents corruption, that creates accountability. During his Khilafah, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu appointed Umar to be a judge against civil disputes between people. And after 2 years, Umar radiallahu anhu came to Abu Bakr and said to him, I would like to retire from this position. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said to him, why? And he said, because there are no disputes coming my way. People are dealing with their own affairs, and they're solving their own problems amongst each other. I have literally nothing to arbitrate. Therefore, there is no need for my position. I need to be repurposed and to do something different. The society reached a level where people were able to normalize because there was very few outlets within the social sphere that allowed for corruption to take place. And this is, again, the notion of shura and accountability. This is why power should never be concentrated within the hands of one or even a few very closely related cronies. This is why those who have power have to be held with multiple layers of accountability to hold them in check and ensure that they are not abusing their power. So we as Muslims need to understand now that one of the issues we have is going back to this idea that anybody can claim to be a Muslim and we have to take them on their face value. And we love to talk about our statistics, that we are 1.5, 1.6 billion strong. But it has nothing to do with quantity. It has to do with the quality of these followers. And we see in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, the example of Talut, who had tens of thousands of people of his followers. And then, when he gave them a test, only hundreds of them were willing to follow him. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them another test, the vast majority of them left, and there were only maybe a handful that stuck with him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, كَم مِّن فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةً كَثِيرَةً بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. How many a time, historically, not just throughout the Islamic history, but throughout all of history, has a small band, but of well-determined, loyal, principled people, defeated, whether morally, whether militarily, whether intellectually, a much, much larger group against whom they were pitted. And we see this over and over again throughout the history of Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes, he has a message, there's maybe a handful of people who follow him, and everybody else is on the attack against him. But intellectually, the message of Islam was preserved, because Islam did not need many people. It needed people who are resilient. It needed people who believe. And even if they were a few in number, they were many in quantity. And that's why we as Muslims have to recognize that while it is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that our community has proliferated and is basically in almost every country in the world, that because of the diversity of our community and because of our diversity of understandings, we have to take an extra concerted effort to evaluate the quality of our practice, the quality of our understanding of our deen, and the actions we are taking because of Islam, not in spite of Islam. When you are a Muslim, you understand that the principles of corruption have no place in any society. And when you understand this well, you fight against it. And when you fight against it, you effect change. And when 1 billion Muslims have that understanding, no corruption will and should exist in this world. But when different Muslims have different understandings, different interpretations, and those who do have an understanding of what corruption is but remain silent, we just remain a number, a very large denominator that doesn't actually affect much change. So my dear brothers and sisters, I ask you to very sincerely reflect on the importance of addressing corruption socially. And I'd like to just add a final reminder of addressing corruption internally in the latter part of the khutbah. أقول قولي هذا فاستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. It's not a surprise that one of the recurrent patterns that I personally like to mention during my khutbahs is that any change socially must begin locally, and any change locally must start with yourself. And when it comes to corruption, each and every one of us, before we start looking at systematic corruption that is obvious, $20 billion somehow unaccounted for in revenue and oil revenue. And when someone steps up to try to ask questions about where this money goes, they get fired. This is obvious, explicit corruption that most people are able to identify and identify well. But there are very tacit, very subtle forms of corruption that even you and I may be engaging in on a daily basis. And this is where each one has to interrogate themselves and interrogate their personal practice and understand where their personal level of justice practice or corruptibility is in place. For example, we just passed the tax filing season for most people's personal taxes, although I'm sure some people here are still overdue. When you were filing your taxes, Did you do it honestly and with integrity and with knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching you? Or for the sake of $100 here or $20 there, did you just pretend you ignored that receipt, or you ignored that income, or you ignored this? Because this is a form of corruption. It's a small, subtle form of corruption, and that's the problem. Because it's small, because it's insignificant, it's easy to throw under the rug. And it's easy for you to throw it under the rug and still maintain that you are not corrupt, that you are a very stand-up person who is very honest and has the highest integrity. You may even rationalize it and say, look, everybody is going to do this. Everybody does this. My accountant does it. Let me just turn a blind eye and pretend I don't know what they're doing. But when I go to my accountant, I tell them, do whatever you need to do to make sure I get the biggest refund I can get at the end of the year. And I don't want to see anything you're going to be doing. These are all very tacit forms of corruption that you and I may be engaging in our very simple day-to-day transactions. Collusion with other employees against employees. When you're at an exam and you try to cheat. These are the beginnings and the manifestations of corruptions. Do you think a president woke up and all of a sudden decided to accept to overlook $20 billion? Or do you think that this is perhaps a level that someone reaches after they have incrementally grown in personal corruption? That you become blinded to even larger scale corruption. So, in summary, I must reiterate again, lest it be misunderstood, and it's regrettable that these disclaimers have to always be stated, that when I speak about a group like Boko Haram, it is reprehensible what the group stands for and does in the name of the Muslim community. And as a member of the Muslim community, I stand up and reject this practice and claim that it has no basis whatsoever in the historic, scholastic, and intellectual history of Islam. And if anyone or members of these groups would like to prove otherwise, they have a very difficult time doing so. So there is no debate or discussion or argument that this is an absolutely unacceptable, condemnable behavior that has no basis in Islam, and in fact is antithetical to Islam. However, before being the type of knee-jerk reaction community that we sometimes tend to be, and it can be understandable because we're under immense pressure, we're constantly being pressured to react to world events before even having information, we must understand that groups of this nature are a reaction to other systematic problems in society. And if we do not remove or normalize or speak up against these systematic processes in society, we can get rid of that group and a new group will come and replace it shortly thereafter. And that is where the vast majority of our effort as Muslims needs to go. اللهم اغفر لنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت وبارك لنا فيما أعطيت وقنا واصرف عنا برحمتك شر ما قضيت إنك تقضي بالحق سبحانك إنه لا يقضى عليك إنه لا يذل من واليت ولا يعز من عاديت تبارك ربنا وتعاليت اللهم إنا نسألك يا رب العالمين أن لا تجعل لنا في هذا اليوم العظيم ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا مريضا إلا شفيته ولا مبتلا إلا عافيته ولا أسيرا إلا فرجته يا رب العالمين اللهم ارحم موتانا واشف مرضانا برحمتك يا أكرم الأكرمين عباد الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands with justice, maintaining ties of kinship, and performing everything you do with excellence. وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنكَرِ وَالْبَغْيِ. And He prohibits you from lewd behavior, corruption as it's loosely understood, and engaging in lewd speech. يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ. And He reminds you perhaps, unless you may remember. فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ الْعَلِيَّ الْعَظِيمَ الْجَلِيلَ يَذْكُرُكُمْ. So remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala abundantly in public and in private, in your heart and on your tongue, and He shall remember you. وَاذْكُرُوهُ عَلَى نِعَمِهِ يَزِدْكُمْ. And thank Him for His many blessings, and He shall bestow more upon you. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تَصْنَعُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything your heart and your mind conceals. Welcome to Islam.